Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. The Middle East is spiraling out of control, beginning with the October 7 attack on Israel by Hamas that killed 1,200 and took more than 200 hostages, and then Israel's deadly response that has killed more than 10,000, with some estimates as high as 12,000 so far, and hospitals destroyed and innocent civilians trapped in Gaza in hell-like conditions. There appears to be no easy way out. Tonight's guest is a retired professor of international relations, formerly at NYU's Center for Global Affairs, as well as a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. He's an expert on the Middle East, on international negotiations and conflict resolution. Happy to say he's also been on BronxTalk several times. Please join me in welcoming back to the show Professor Alon Ben-Meir. He's on Skype. Nice to see you, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
These are difficult times. Let's just start off with a piece you wrote on October 27th, which was called "The Horrific Breakdown in Israeli-Palestinian Relations. Where do we go from here?" So you told a little of the background. How did we get to the point where we now have escalated a conflict into potentially could be a world war? Goodness gracious, we're hoping that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I must tell you that I was not surprised at all. As a matter of fact, on October 4th of 2022, I wrote a piece, and in that piece I said that unless the situation, the condition between Israel and the Palestinians, and then especially in the West Bank, and calms down, and the occupation, the brutal occupation, somewhat comes to an end, it is only a question of time when the next conflagration will take place and will make the second intifada as a child's play. This is exactly the words I used more than a year ago. So I was not surprised because one only has to look what's been happening in the West Bank, especially since this new government, the most extremist Messianic government, came to power in Israel with a specific agenda to subordinate the judiciary to political whims, as well as to annex as much as possible territories in the West Bank and prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state at all costs. And as a result, of course, there is a growing Palestinian resistance. Last year alone, more than 300 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank, and this year, as of now, nearly 400 Palestinians were killed. So the relationship been extremely tense for over a year, and it was no surprise, as I said, that this horrifying, tragic unfolded in front of our eyes.
I'm going to pull out some of the words that you wrote, and we'll just go through it. We'll put them up on the screen for you. Despair, depression, and hopelessness swept much of the Palestinian population, akin to the gathering of a ferocious storm that successive Israeli governments, led by Netanyahu, chose to brush off. So, you're in some ways laying right at the feet of the prime minister and say, well, had you taken care of this, had you worked to help people develop a culture, you might have discouraged, that's what your point is, if I'm guessing right, you might have discouraged this kind of overt reaction that of course has escalated.
There is no doubt in my mind. If you go and look historically what Netanyahu has been doing, he has deliberately allowed Hamas to grow. He's been allowed $350 million to go from Qatar to Hamas year after year, employing no more than 20,000 Palestinians coming from the Gaza to Israel, because from his perspective is to allowing Hamas to basically to divide and conquer. And he said it time and again, the Palestinian Authority is a liability, Hamas is an asset. We have to continue the conflict between the two in order to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And I just might add this. It was abundantly clear that the forces, the security in the south along the border with Gaza, being thinned dramatically. Many of the soldiers actually went to the West Bank, to Jerusalem, because of this expansionist policy of this government, and basically left the settlers, the kibbutzim in that area, pretty much defenseless. This is what happened. And this is fact. It's been checked out time and again. And Netanyahu still refuses to take the responsibility.
Do you think the Israeli people who had protests prior to October 7th against what Netanyahu did with the judicial system, do you think they support this war at this point? Or on some levels, is Prime Minister Netanyahu kind of doing his own thing, so to speak? In other words, what about his popularity in-house, in Israel itself?
Well, right now, his popularity has not been as low as ever before. And I think once this war is over, he will be accountable, and and I don't believe he will be able to survive politically once this war is over. But I need to mention to you something which is tragic in the sense that the Israelis bought into the argument, pretty much, advocated by Netanyahu himself, that the Palestinian will always pose existential threat to Israel. And therefore, the occupation becomes necessary to prevent them from threatening Israel existentially. The Israelis bought into this argument, which was fundamentally wrong. And I've been saying time and again, if hundreds of thousands of Israelis were ready to pour into the streets for 6 months, every single Saturday, to prevent the so-called judicial reform, where are they when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been simmering? Because from their perspective, just remember this, 85% of Israelis were born after 1967, under the occupation, and 90% of all Palestinians been living under occupation. So the occupation became normal state of affair, basically for the Israelis, and they felt safe and secure as long as they felt they can sustain it. Now they have realized that the occupation is not sustainable, that the blockade is just not sustainable, and this eruption, this horrible eruption now, in my view, offers an opportunity to reevaluate what's been happening and come to the conclusion that this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians will not end under any circumstances unless it ends with a two-state solution.
One of the things that you mentioned is that Netanyahu's perspective was basically that Palestinians and Hamas were the same thing. Now the dialogue is emerging that Hamas was a radical group, so to speak, and the Palestinian people, many of whom are being murdered, and of course in a terrible circumstance right now, that those people are not the people who Israel should be angry at. But Netanyahu doesn't see, he seems to blend it. He doesn't see a difference between Hamas and everyday Palestinians who, frankly, are getting killed in hospitals right now.
And you're absolutely right. And this was a matter of choice. That is, the PLO recognized Israel in the West Bank. And going back to 1993, the Oslo Accord. Hamas hasn't. But Hamas represents the resistance movement. That is, as long as Israel refuses to a two-state solution, Hamas felt they have an obligation to maintain their resistance against Israel. So Israel basically made no real effort to mitigate its differences with the so-called the extremist Palestinians, but in fact deliberately kept them this way because, as I said earlier, dividing and conquering was the policy of the Netanyahu government all the last 15 years.
It's interesting to me that despite what we see on TV, despite the obvious conflict, despite what appears to be unresolvable, you in your writing have proposed solutions. I want to just put up some of your words, and you mentioned it here, and I want to show people what you've written. By the way, you can go to Alon Ben-Meir's website and read all of this stuff. But what he wrote was, this incomprehensible massacre offers, under horrifying circumstances, an unprecedented opportunity to bring a gradual end to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I appreciate your optimism. How realistic is this? Or is this going to have to be something like in a democratic nation, the people are going to have to force Netanyahu to think this way?
I say that after this conflict, Israel will never be the same, nor will the Palestinians be the same again. What is happening here? In conflict resolution, you can negotiate, you try to mitigate differences, you can compensate, you provide incentive to resolve conflict. And sometimes none of this work. And sometimes a major breakdown in the conflict, such as what happened, the attack of Hamas against innocent Israelis, and the Israeli retaliation, which is unprecedented. This kind of breakdown could lead to a breakthrough. I believe that, having taught international negotiation and conflict resolution for more than 20 years, we've come across so many conflicts around the world. When more often than not, it took this kind of major conflagration to change the dynamic of the conflict. And this change now it presents itself. Once these hostilities end, as I said, every party to the conflict, directly or indirectly, be that the Israelis, the Palestinians, certainly the United States and Saudi Arabia in the lead, are to take advantage of the changing dynamics of the conflict and begin a process of reconciliation in order to lead to eventually to peace between the two sides. It is an opportunity, as I said, however, albeit under the most horrifying circumstances.
A ceasefire is being suggested. Of course, we're recording this on the 21st of November. It will air on the 27th, so things could change between now and then. The president has been, the American president has been talking about hostages being released, possibly in exchange for a ceasefire. It seems to me that what you are hoping for or suggesting can't possibly happen till there is a ceasefire. And maybe after a ceasefire, there could be some negotiation that you're talking about? Or is Israel too far away from that?
No, this had to be, of course, end to the hostilities in Gaza in one form or another. That is a prerequisite. Otherwise, you cannot really sit down with the Palestinian and negotiate anything. So that has to end. That is a prerequisite. But there is an opportunity to present itself now once the conflict, when the hostilities end. I must mention here that Hamas politically may be defeated, but physically they will not be defeated. That is, they will not die at the battlefield. We have to create, that is, in order to advance a peace process, you have to create an alternative to Hamas. And mind you, the Palestinians in Gaza have been suffering under Hamas just as much, in fact, and more so than under the occupation in the West Bank. So Hamas is not exactly the most popular movement among the Palestinians, but that's all they've got. And this is the resistance they relied on in order to change the dynamics of the conflict. Yes.
Let me just ask you. You wrote, and I thought this was kind of interesting. You wrote that, and this was on October 27th. You wrote, Israel should not undertake a large-scale ground invasion of Gaza. Israel should come to terms with the inevitability of the Palestinian state. Although I think that's, maybe pie in the sky hope. But even having said that, were you surprised by Israel's tremendously violent and offensive strike? Were you surprised?
I wasn't surprised, but I'm saddened by it because I don't think, regardless of the horrifying destruction that Gaza and the people of Gaza have suffered. Remember, we have created now a new crisis when two-thirds of the population already been displaced. They became internally displaced. When the scarcity of food, fuel, medicine are so rampant, we have created, in Israel, created an unprecedented, horrifying situation in Gaza. So what happened is that if you wanted to deal with the Palestinian resistance and violence, the more you Palestinian died, the greater the resistance become. This is one of the reasons I said it is not wise to invade Gaza, because there would have been other approaches to take in order to mitigate the conflict between the two sides. But leave it to Netanyahu, who actually been under tremendous pressure. You know, he's been indicted on 3 different charges, and he failed so far to completely reform the judiciary. He's been under great political pressure, and now he, in my view, took advantage of the situation in order to emerge as a war hero. He was not a war hero, and he will not be a war hero, because, in my view, he precipitated this horrible conflict from day one.
Your latest piece was entitled, "What is Israel's End Game in Gaza?" which is an interesting question. I mean, is it complete annihilation? Your concern is that unless they articulate their end game, it's going to spark a wider war. How does the sympathy, world sympathy really, toward for the Palestinians play? Will it force Netanyahu's hand? Does he listen to that kind of thing? Or is he just going to say, you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead?
Well, he'll be able now to continue this fight for a while. Ceasefire will be established sooner or later, and the war will come to an end. Whether it's going to take a month or 2 or 3 more, we will have to see. But once this is over, there will be, in my view, tremendous pressure from the United States, albeit from behind the scene, because it's an election year after all, that the government ought to change its direction toward the Palestinian. President Biden has reiterated now time and again and said, two-state solution as today has become more relevant, more important, more necessary than any other time before, because this conflict will not end unless the Palestinians realize their national aspiration. I think he is right. Now the question is, will he put his foot down and begin to put the kind of pressure necessary on Israel to change its approach? One more thing. Netanyahu or any Israeli future government is interested in normalization of relations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab states. Saudi Arabia, in this regard, could reopen the negotiation about normalization of relations between the two countries on the condition that Israel begin a peace process with the Palestinians. So Saudi Arabia and the United States can play significant role in moving the Israelis in the direction where eventually peace between the two sides on a two-state solution will be able to take place. I just want to add one sentence to that. I am not naive enough to tell you this can happen within a year or two, because there's tremendous amount of hatred, animosity, distrust between the two sides. So you have to begin with the process of reconciliation.
One of the questions, and actually it's going to come up in Congress after the first of the year, of course, when they renegotiate a budget deal that was, kind of pushed off to a couple of months later. Do you think President Biden and the United States is bold enough, is strong enough to do what you said, to whether withhold funding or put other kinds of pressure on Netanyahu to change his point of view about a two-state solution?
As I indicated earlier, this is an election year. Both Democrats and Republicans need the evangelical vote, which is very significant in any election. And the evangelicals support Israel under any condition, comes what may, they support Israel. So President Biden will certainly be under pressure not to exert too much pressure on Israel. That's why I said the pressure will have to be behind the scene. And one other point, I believe that the Netanyahu government, as it is composed today, the coalition will not survive once once the war is over. So President Biden will have an opportunity to deal with a new prime minister who will be far more in tune to listening to the United States advice, because without which, as we have seen already, Israel really cannot undertake any major significant conflict without the United States backing. And this is so the United States now ought to translate its wishes to something realistic by pushing for the two-state solution and mobilize the Saudis, other Gulf states, in order to entice Israel to move in that direction.
I want to put up another excerpt from this current piece. You said that President Biden should demand that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his military brass develop, in coordination with the United States, a clear exit strategy and an endgame consistent with Israel's, the Palestinians, and the U.S.'s national interests. It's easy to say that, but do you have an idea of what that would look like? What do you think Netanyahu and the Israelis think that their end game is? Is it literally to annihilate all the people? And I mean, is genocide the way to go? It just seems crazy.
Not. Absolutely not. The Palestinians in Gaza are going to remain in Gaza. Egypt does not really allow any Palestinian to leave Gaza, nor would Israel would want to allow them to come to Israel proper. The Palestinian exists there. Hamas will be weakened, dramatically weakened. And so Israel needs to have an exit strategy. I suggested in my last piece that what you need to do with the United Nations, with the support of the United States, and mind you, even China and Russia might support that, to create an administrative governing authority in Gaza to handle the administration throughout Gaza. And the 6 Arab countries that are at peace with Israel, namely Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, ought to put together a peacekeeping force in Gaza for the next, in my view, it will take about 18 months allow the Israelis and the Palestinians, specifically the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, which will have to take control over Gaza as well. There you need a new election. Mahmoud Abbas is not in a position. He's too corrupt and too old, for that matter, to undertake a new responsibility in Gaza. So you need an election in the Palestinian territories, and you also need election in Israel. So these two things are going to take place. And therefore, I'm suggesting 18 months whereby the United Nations with the Arab forces in Gaza to remain until the change of government, which is unavoidable, I repeat, is unavoidable, take place both in the West Bank and Israel proper. And then you can begin in earnest executing the exit strategy that need to be developed now, not later.
You just were talking about the United Nations. The UNWRA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is the agency that you fingered and said, they ought to be involved in this. Do you think the United Nations has enough respect by people in the Middle East and even in the United States to take that kind of a role at this point in the world? I mean, is that? It sounds like a good solution. But is it realistic? I mean, is the United States well respected enough to really enter in there with troops and do it efficiently?
Yeah, when I say United States is an umbrella, the question is the composition of the countries that will administer the area. These are the most important. So you need some Palestinian, some Arab states, you need some European states, you need perhaps even American. That is, you're not going to have a United Nations just putting any kind of administrative entity to take over. The composition of the countries, that's what's going to matter the most, albeit under the United Nations umbrella, because you need an international umbrella under which you can undertake something like this. But there's an alternative to that. The Arab League also can arrange for that to take place. But my feeling is the United Nations will be more suitable to undertake such task.
You know, one of the things I thought was interesting that you mentioned was if you, look back at the history of it over the years, this conflict was almost bound to escalate in this way, especially because that's the way that Netanyahu had envisioned a certain class of people. I mean, it's racist in its own way. It's, but having done that, it riles people up across the world. I want to kind of conclude with a final piece from your work, from your latest story. And I thought this was quite interesting. Israel will lose the war unless a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians begins once the war comes to an end under the auspices of the United States and Saudi Arabia, which must lead to a two-state solution. We just got about a minute. Do you think that if there is a ceasefire because of the exchange of hostages, that would be the opportunity you're looking for to step in and say, well, wait a minute, now we've done this, let's go to the next step toward peace?
Well, the ceasefire is the first step. The question is under what condition the ceasefire will take place. Is it going to be temporary for 2 or 3 days, or they're going to build on it a permanent cessation of hostilities? That's going to be very, very important. Also, the release of all the hostages is a prerequisite. To start, of course, with women and children to begin with. But again, the United States and Israel, the Saudis in particular, ought to be keen about this. There is an opportunity that they can exploit it, and the sooner they move on it, the better it is for the Arab state, the Palestinians, as well as Israel.
Professor Alon Ben-Meir, thank you so much. We invite all our viewers to check out alonbenmeir.com because you can get all this information. You can agree, you can disagree, but being informed is so important. And you have done that for the people of the Bronx this evening. Alon Ben-Meir, we thank you so much, and we appreciate you joining us all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we will see you next week. We want to thank our producer is Rebecca Hemick. Our director is my good friend Nick Marrero. We have the cast of thousands working with us here in the studio. And of course, we thank our viewers in the borough of the Bronx. Next week, we'll continue the dialogue. We'll talk with 2 religious leaders who just returned from Israel and from both sides of the coin. And we'll get a direct report from them about what it's been like in the middle of this very difficult war. So if the curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise, yeah, we will. We'll be back next week. Good night.